Your crypto has crashed, your portfolio has gone bust, and the bank has repossessed your Lambo. So now you've only got $30,000 to spend on a sports car, and it has to be new so your friends don't know that you're actually broke. Oh, and it's got to have a manual transmission for that street cred. Well, my friend, here are the only 9 sports cars that you can buy for under $30K MSRP in the USA. If you want to look like you spent more than you did, the Toyota GR86 is just the ticket. It's got some nice curves, cool looking taillights, functional aero, and the fender bulge answers the question, are you happy to see me? It's just a good looking car. The 2.4 liter flat 4 cranks out 228 horsepower and 184 torques. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but the car only weighs a little over 2,800 pounds. And that infamous torque dip from the last generation, hasta la vista, baby. Well, for the most part, it's actually gone. Maximum torque now comes on at about 3,700 RPM. In the last generation, it was way higher up in the rev band. So that just makes it much more fun to drive. And it comes with one of the best manual transmissions around. It was great in the last generation, but somehow Toyota managed to make it even more satisfying than before. And of course, it comes in an automatic too, that I think is pretty good for the price point. But what really sets the GR86 apart is that it's tuned for the racetrack right from the factory. In fact, at the launch, Toyota actually took us to a racetrack, let us loose, and let us ring out these cars. Now, assuming that the dealers don't take you for a ride, so to speak, the GR86 starts at $28,725, and that includes destination fees. Now, these cars are very hard to get a hold of right now, but you might have a little bit more luck with our next car on the list. Okay, yes, the Subaru BRZ is very similar to the GR86, but there's a reason I put it on the list, and we'll get to that in just a second. Now, both cars are actually built in Japan on the Subaru assembly line. Now, you're probably wondering, what's the difference between the BRZ and the GR86? Well, first up, the nose is quite different. The BRZ has a different grille. It has these wide horizontal slats, and it's sort of a trapezoid, whereas the GR86 is just a little simpler and a little cleaner in my opinion. Next, the suspension tuning is a little bit different too. Mind you, you'd probably have to drive these cars back to back to really notice the difference. The Subaru is a little firmer up front and softer in the rear, and the sway bar is mounted to the unibody, whereas in the 86 it's mounted to the subframe. But what does that mean for driving dynamics? The Subaru is going to turn in a little bit better, and it's going to feel a little bit crisper at the beginning of your corner, but as you're progressing through the corner, it's likely to understeer a little bit earlier, whereas the GR86 is a little bit more of a slidey boy. Turn-in isn't going to be quite as crisp, and the rear is going to tend to come out a little bit more than the BRZ, so it's going to feel a little bit less stable. It's just a little bit more of a rock and roll kind of machine, where the BRZ is going to feel just a little bit more competent on city streets and canyons and sort of day-to-day driving. Just a little bit of a difference in character. But let's face it, these are minor differences and you're gonna mod it anyhow. But here's why the BRZ is on the list. It is just easier to get, and you can find them at dealers right now. And in my research, it's easier to find them without markup. The 2023 Subaru BRZ starts at $29,615 with destination fee, and it comes in World Rally Blue, and coincidentally, the same color that you can get as the next car on the list. So maybe small and lightweight isn't your thing. Maybe you want something a little bit more practical, and you dream about turbos and kind of getting sideways in the dirt. That's right, I'm talking about the brand new for 2022 Subaru WRX. It's the newest car on the list, and yes, it does come in WR Blue and a manual transmission. In fact, every car on this list has a manual transmission. Now, it's got essentially the same 2.4 liter 4-cylinder boxer engine as the BRZ, but in the WRX, it is turbocharged. And here it makes 271 horsepower and 258 pound-feet of torque. And let's face it, you're not gonna keep this car stock. You like power, you're gonna tune it, and you're gonna get slideways with it. So this is one of the fastest cars on the list, and if you wanna mod it, there is a ton of aftermarket support for the WRX. And because it's all-wheel drive, it actually makes it kind of difficult to get into a lot of trouble. That makes it a pretty good car if you're sort of a beginner, higher horsepower car enthusiast. And of course, because it has all-wheel drive, it's good in the winter. Now, the styling of the new WRX is kind of controversial. I can't say that I'm the biggest fan, but hey, let's face it, Subaru has always made kind of interesting looking WRXs. Personally, I don't think you buy them for the styling, but that's a personal decision. Now, I wish it still came in the hatchback, but it does still fit 4 people pretty comfortably, and it makes it one of the more practical cars on the list. And if you want to keep it under $30,000, you do need to keep the CVT transmission, which you probably didn't want anyways. It's $29,605, and when you add in the destination, you're looking at about $30,600. So yeah, we went over by $600, but believe me, there are very few sports cars under $30,000 that you can buy in 2022. Now let's say you like crowds, or maybe you just enjoy hunting crowds. Well, in that case, this next car is the best choice. Yes, I'm talking about the wild pony, the Mustang Ecoboost. And before you say, I could have had a V8, hear me out. First off, the Mustang GT with the V8 you're looking at is close to $40,000. It's about $10,000 beyond our budget. And second, the 2.3 liter Ecoboost makes 310 horsepower and 350 pound-feet of torque, and it's about 240 pounds lighter, and all that missing weight is from the nose of the car. And that means it handles better. And the Mustang has a very established tuning community, perhaps one of the biggest out there, and that means you can get an extra 60 horsepower with pretty much just a tune. Yeah, and this is probably one of the oldest cars on the list, but you get rear-wheel drive, you get a manual transmission, you get pretty good power, and I still think it's a pretty good-looking car. I kind of like the slightly retro styling. It's got a huge aftermarket community, parts are cheap, and with the destination fee, it's $28,865. Frankly, it's easier to get a Mustang than some of the other cars on the list. This is not the hottest, newest thing. And if you like American, there's only one more car on the list, and let's talk about that. And that's its arch rival, also from Detroit, the Chevy Camaro LS and LT. And this is also the cheapest car on the list. If you opt for the 2-liter turbo engine, you're gonna be at $26,395, including destination. And if 275 horsepower just isn't enough, you can get the 3.6-liter V6, which makes 335 horsepower, and coincidentally is also the most powerful car on this list. And it's still only $28,490. Yes, like the Mustang, the Camaro is getting a little bit dated, and yeah, it's a little bit less practical than the Mustang too, let's be honest, it's got a tiny trunk, but I think it has better suspension, and I think it's a better driving car too. Now the interior is pretty basic, but if you like a manual transmission, it's actually a pretty good one. Honestly, 335 horsepower is fast enough, and compared to the V8, it is definitely a better handling car. I've driven them both. There's no question, if you put the right tires on it, you can go around corners, and it's a good canyon carver, and it's a little bit of a sleeper too. And because it's rear-wheel drive, you can still do some sweet donuts. And because Chevy doesn't sell a ton of these, they're actually relatively easy to find at dealers, and you can probably get one without ADM. That's additional dealer markup and something that no one really wants. Now, if a 2-door domestic car isn't exactly your jam, let's talk about the most sophisticated car on this list, and it's German. Yes, we're going back to the motherland for this. It's the new for 2022 8th generation Volkswagen Golf GTI. And of course, the GTI is perhaps the original, or one of the original, hot hatches. And it's the only hatch on this list. Now for 2022, the 2-liter E888 engine is really smooth, and now it makes 241 horsepower and 273 pound-feet of torque. Of course, it's powering the front wheels, and you can get it with a 6-speed manual or the DSG dual clutch transmission. And you also get a torque sensing limited slip differential, so you don't get that one tire fire when you're peeling out of corners at the track, because you're taken to the track, right? So admittedly, the GTI is not really a track car, but very few of these on the list are. However, it's based on the VW MQB architecture, which means it's a really solid chassis. I've driven them. I think it's very good. I had an Audi S3 with that chassis, and it's a pretty good looking car too. And you can actually still put stuff in the hatch. It's not super huge, but you can put the back seats down. Now the interior is probably the best looking of all these cars on the list. It's very quiet, and the driver display is very good. However, the haptic touch controls for the heating and ventilation and infotainment system are not very good. They're kind of confusing, and in fact VW is probably going back to regular manual controls, which is a good thing. But if you're looking for luxury, great handling, and good power, I think this car is sort of the best balance of the three of anything else on the list. And that also means it's the most expensive car on this list too, at $29,880. Once you add that destination in, you're at $30,975. So yeah, we went over by almost $1,000, but I wanted to get some cars in this list because the list is shrinking every year. And if you want the DSG, that's going to add about another $1,000, which means it's definitely not going to make the cut. So just spring for the manual. It's a pretty good one. But you know what does make the cut? That's the next car, and that is the Honda Civic SI. It's also new for 2022, and the SI isn't a track car, but it is a very, very good driver-focused car. It is very rewarding to drive and shift. And it's quite a bit cheaper than the GTI. It's $28,595 with destination. And if you're just gonna have the one car that does everything, this is a really good choice. In fact, it might be your best choice. It's got the biggest trunk in the list, it's got a really big back seat, and it does love to carve up back roads. The suspension feels good. However, it's not that fast. It's got a 1.5 liter turbo four-banger that makes just 200 horsepower and 192 pound-feet of torque, of course sending them just to the front wheels, but the only transmission you can get is a manual, and that is totally okay with me. As I mentioned before, the suspension is pretty firm, perhaps not as much as the WRX, but I think it's definitely at the higher end of what you would consider for a comfortable daily driver. But with that suspension, you get really good handling in the twisties. It's got what I think is an excellent interior in this group. It's very simple, but the physical controls are really satisfying. They're clean, they're easy to use. The whole dash just looks crisp and clean. Very different from the GTI. The seats are very comfortable, they have good bolstering, but of course they're cloth, and this whole package is just not as luxe as the GTI. But because it's one of the slowest cars on this list, the upside is that you can expect to see up to about 37 mpg on the highway. It's not a fancy car, but Honda has put a lot of thought and care and design into this car, and it's a cheap, relatively speaking, modern, economical sports sedan that kind of does everything, so it's pretty high up on my list. And next up, we're talking about the Toyota Corolla Apex Edition. No, unfortunately, it's not the uber fancy 300 horsepower all-wheel drive Corolla GR. We know that's going to be at least $10,000 or more beyond what's in this list, but hear me out. Corolla Apex Edition is kind of a sleeper Corolla. Now, it's the same 2-liter naturally aspirated dynamic force engine as other Corollas, and a limited number come with a manual transmission. It's a pretty good manual. It's pretty easy to learn. It's got auto rev matching. I like it, but that's not what makes the Apex the top Corolla until the GR Corolla comes out. It does have a track-tuned suspension tested on the Higashi Fuji Proving Ground in Japan. It's 0.6 inches lower, and it does have a stiffer anti-roll bar and special dampers, and that means it corners really flat. It also has specially tuned steering, and it's got a louder catback exhaust. It also returns 36 mpg on the highway, so this is not going to break your bank account with crazy gas prices that we have right now. Now, it's not fast, but it is the second cheapest car on the list at $26,895 with destination, and it's going to be relatively difficult to get. This is a fairly limited edition car, and this brings us to the last sports car that you can still get in the USA for under 30 grand. And that, of course, is the car that is always the answer. I'm talking about the Miata MX5. In this case, it is also the lightest and smallest car on the list, and honestly, the Miata is really in a class by itself. It's the cheapest convertible you can buy, and it is one of the best handling cars on the road today. That's because it weighs just a little over 2,300 pounds. That makes it one of the lightest cars that you can buy right now. The Civic SI weighs over 600 pounds more. So while the 2-liter Skyactiv naturally aspirated engine makes 181 horsepower, it actually doesn't feel that slow because it's pretty light and because the gearing is pretty good too. And the manual transmission is really one of the most enjoyable to drive pretty much at any price point. It's a honey. And they've improved the handling for 2022 because every Miata now gets something called Kinematic posture control. And it sounds like a gimmick, but it actually works really well. When you're cornering, it applies a little bit of brake to the inside rear wheel, and that helps bring that corner down, so it reduces body roll, and it actually helps rotate the car. It doesn't add any weight, and it really works. And let's face it, the Miata is just simple and it's an absolute joy to drive. And at $28,665 with destination, it is one of the purest sports cars you can buy. It's tiny, it's highly impractical, and when you go up in trim levels, it gets a lot more expensive, but I still love it. I was looking for 10 sports cars that you can get for under $30,000, but that is a shrinking list. And unfortunately, the Acura Integra, the Hyundai Veloster N, and the Mini Cooper S are now all over $30,000, so they didn't quite make the cut. If you enjoyed this video, I've got another one on affordable sports cars. Click it right here.